Thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. We have a terrific panel with exceptionally skilled practitioners and election experts to talk about this year's elections and what we need to learn from them to safeguard our democracy into the future. I'm Mara Redman, CAP's Executive Vice President for Policy, and I am so glad that you've decided to join us today. This year, we saw significant strains on our electoral system. Ultimately, our systems demonstrated our democracy's resilience, but also exposed weaknesses. On the positive side, we saw a higher share of the voting eligible population than at any time in the last 120 years. That's a great sign of the vibrancy of democracy. It also means a heavy load for our election administration, particularly during the pandemic. The conditions around COVID forced states to adapt quickly to a once a century, we hope, pandemic that meant quickly shifting to mail-in ballots, deploying drop boxes, recruiting new and younger poll workers, and confronting prohibitions in some states against counting mail ballots prior to Election Day. Sadly, we also saw the corrosive effects of disinformation shared by politicians and amplified over digital platforms that continues to impact many voters' confidence in the election outcome. Our democracy has remained strong because our elected leaders, those seeking office, and perhaps most importantly, state and local election officials appreciated the importance of public confidence in our elections and did their jobs. For all the fraughtness and the tension, though, Election Day was remarkably normal. People voted, many before Election Day to be sure, and then votes were counted. Litigation has ensued and states have been certifying election results. So today, we aim to look both backward and forward, asking what went right, what didn't, what lessons we should learn, and what this all means for us fortifying our elections into the future, so all Americans can share confidence in election outcomes. I am so pleased to introduce to you the panelists we have here today for the discussion. We're really thrilled to have them. First, Ben Ginsberg, who has been counsel to multiple presidential, state, local campaigns, and is a former co-chair of the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration. He also, for those who haven't seen it, has a terrifically on-point opinion piece in the Washington Post, published, I believe, just yesterday. And I think a lot of what he had in that we'll be talking about today. We welcome Janai Nelson, Associate Director General of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She has published on issues of domestic and comparative election law, democracy, race, and criminal justice, is a contributor on various media forums, and works with the President and Director Council of the LDF to determine and execute LDF's strategic vision and oversee the operations of its programs. And we have Norm Ornstein, resident scholar, American Enterprise Institute, board chair, Campaign Legal Center. Among many other things, Norm has previously served as co-director of the AI Brookings Election Reform Project and senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. So I'm sure you all can see why. So excited to have all of the three panelists we have here today participating with us. And we will have an opportunity for everyone at the end to be able to ask questions. So please, those of you in the audience, feel free to send in your questions as we go. And I'd like to start for all three of our panelists with a question that kind of centers us in the date and time that we're in that tomorrow, December 8th, is known as the safe harbor deadline for states to appoint their electors for the Electoral College. Can you briefly explain to those in our audience the importance of the safe harbor date? And in addition to that, whether there are any last ditch gambits we should anticipate related to counting electoral votes, which, as we know, Congress will be doing on January 6th. So December 8th, why does it matter?
Well, because it's there's a provision in the old Electoral Count Act of 1877, a somewhat arcane law we blissfully never had to really deal with in this election. But that's the date that if the states have their slate of electors complete, which I think all the states do at this point, then they are presumptively correct when Congress goes to count them on January 6th.
Janai, Norm, thanks.
So December 8th is the deadline for resolving any election disputes. And we know that this election has been bombarded with a number of disputes in courts that have largely been rejected by the president, suggesting that there was voter fraud and vote tampering and illegitimacy in the election. That's been roundly rebuked. And so the hope is that tomorrow, all state recounts, court contests, or any other disputes concerning the presidential election will be completed and certification will happen. There are other significant dates that follow tomorrow's safe harbor deadline, including on December 14th, where the electors in each state meet and cast their ballots for president and vice president. Those ballots are then received by the president of the Senate on December 23rd. And then on January 6th, the Congress meets in a joint session to count the ballots. And ultimately, there should be a peaceful transition of power on January 20th when the president-elect becomes the president. So we hope that everything follows the order that it has followed for over 100 years and that we can rely on a peaceful transition. But I think we all know that there may be some hijinks between now and then.
So let me just add that there are the legal consequences here, part of that Electoral Count Act. That, as Ben said, means that it is presumptively clear, once states have certified, that Congress will accept those. There's the normative element of this as well. We know from the Washington Post reports yesterday, they had 25 reporters canvass every Republican in the House and Senate, and barely 12% have acknowledged that Joe Biden is president-elect. One should assume that once it becomes semi-official, when these court cases have been either resolved or made moot by this date, that that's a point at which members can say, all right, this is over, all except the shouting. Although we have no strong reason to believe that that will actually be the case. And we know that there are still challenges going forward, even though the December 8th date will be met by all of the states.
Thanks, Norm. Ben, maybe let me turn back to you, if I might, to get your perspective as certainly an election lawyer who has counseled multiple Republican presidential campaigns and state and local efforts. You have a unique view, I think, into what has happened this year. What would you say, both what in terms of how would you describe the most important stress points on the electoral system that you've seen thus far this fall? What steps do you think are needed to ensure we improve going forward? And let me wrap into that what Norm has flagged. How concerned are you about what may yet happen between now and January 6th?
Fair enough. Well, I certainly agree with your framing that this was a unique election. Donald Trump and his rhetoric attacking the very foundations of the system was certainly unique. No president, no presidential candidate from a major party has done it the way that President Trump did. Of course, the pandemic played a role in that as well. The very polarized nature of the country as a whole also plays a role in what we saw and what the stress was. And interestingly enough, in that polarized time with a Trumpian figure, we also had record-breaking turnout. So those are all, that's a combustible mixture right there. And at the end of the day, sitting here right now, the country came through pretty well. There was certainly trauma for 4 weeks, but at this point, all the states have certified their results. There are certainly procedural steps that members of the House and the Senate can take on January 6th, but it's a little hard to imagine them going anywhere. So what we saw in terms of stress points was certainly a number of laws that could use some improving. The Electoral Count Act is one. The way we handle absentee ballots is another. there are a number of points that are laid out in that post-op-ed from yesterday that could be reformed. I think one thing that we saw about our system is that while we are a country of laws, it was remarkable how our officials did the right thing in the incredibly stressful situation. And that human element that came through, and I'm especially proud of the Republican elected officials who stood up to the great onslaught from the president, who stood up for the system and the way their states were supposed to work, and the tools they used to do that, which we can, I think we'll discuss in a little bit, is really important. And I think there is some interesting lessons to be learned from this. From a Republican perspective, Republicans did just fine in a very high turnout election, the highest turnout election. It's true that Republicans lost the presidency, but certainly in the down ballot races, Republicans did just fine in that high turnout election. The other thing, and I suspect we'll be talking about this more if I say it, but the Democrats showed that they can win in tight states where there are voter identification laws in place. And Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona have some of the strictest laws in the country, and Democrats managed to win. And as Republican governors in Arizona and Georgia stood up to the president, they were able to point to the voter identification rules as giving them a basis on which to say the president is wrong, we run good elections. And so I think that each party needs to re-examine some of the basic premises it's used in these issues.
Thanks, Ben. Janai,
Mara,
sure, Norm, go ahead.
I just want to add a couple of things to what Ben said. The first is, I think we can all offer kudos to the election officials around the country, Democrats and Republicans. I've been watching elections just about as long as Ben, which is a long time. And I've never seen an election that was run this smoothly. We always have glitches. It's the nature of the process. You're going to have issues that will arise. There were fewer of them with this amazingly high turnout election than I can remember. Everybody stepped up to the plate, including thousands of people who devoted a lot of time to making this happen. But in particular, the secretaries of state in key states, the governors that Ben mentioned, and now we've seen judges from across the board step up. The president and his allies have filed a huge number of court cases. They are 1 in 48. And judges have looked at the evidence, such as it is, and made judgments. That's the good news. The bad news here, especially, is more on the informal front, and it starts with the president and what he has been saying about this, but it extends further down. You've probably seen that last night, Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State in Michigan, a state which was not close by any standard, which Joe Biden won by over 150,000 votes, that she was with her 4-year-old doing Christmas decorations when a group of heavily armed thugs gathered outside the house in the dark, chanting and shouting obscenities with bullhorns. And that's all a part of what is a broader misinformation and disinformation that's being spread by a lot of people, including people who should know better. Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, among them, saying on Fox this morning that ballots were counted in foreign countries and shifted all over the place. And while we need to do the things that Ben has suggested in his terrific op-ed, and I'd go a little further and we will discuss those a little bit further on, we have to try and change the norms in this system, or we're going to lose the confidence in our election process, even when it's run really, really well.
Thanks, Ben. Janai, I'd be interested in your reactions to Ben and Norm's comments, but also in addition to that, and this may be kind of both explicit and implicit in what they've said, it seems to me that we saw some efforts to disenfranchise voters, especially communities of color in large urban areas. For example, Harris County. Can you discuss that as well as any reactions you may have to what they've said?
Sure. So I agree with much of what's been said in terms of the kudos that our over almost 9,000 election officials throughout the country deserve in ensuring that our ballots were largely counted without any interruption, despite the pressures from this administration to do otherwise. But I do have to provide a bit of a contrarian view in terms of how smoothly the election ran. It did not run smoothly for everyone in the country, and it didn't run smoothly, not just on election day, but in months leading up to the election with the crisis of the pandemic, providing deeper stresses on communities that are already often marginalized and excluded from the electorate. We're now a month out from election day, so we can have a bit more of a sober assessment of what some of those concerns were. And that assessment reveals a very persistent strain of racial discrimination, of harmful racial disparities in the impediments to casting a ballot in our democracy. The Legal Defense Fund is a nonpartisan organization. We, for the past 20 years, have engaged in nonpartisan election protection efforts. We, along with the Lawyers Committee and other civil rights organizations, founded the Election Protection Hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. Many folks have heard about it, where we field calls on election day. And the Legal Defense Fund has also stood up its own operation to protect voters, the Voter Defender Project. And on election day alone, the hotline received 32,000 calls of, from voters reporting various incidences and various obstacles that we had to run down. That does not include the many concerns that we received during the early voting period. We all saw the lines in Milwaukee during early voting, and largely African Americans who were standing there for hours to get access to the ballot. We also know that there were a number of efforts to malign African American voters who lived in predominantly Black cities like Philly, like Detroit, like Atlanta, where the president suggested there was widespread voter fraud and urged election officials not to count and certify those ballots. So I have to push back on the idea that this election ran smoothly in all aspects, because it certainly did not. And LDF's president and director counsel wrote a piece in slate.com pushing back on this very idea, because that simply wasn't the lived experience of many Black voters or the organizations that are devoted to protecting their votes. The truth is that there was a torrent of obstacles to impede Black voters from exercising the right to vote. And I can give you just a few examples. In addition to the hotline matters that we saw, there were documented reports of armed people showing up at the polls, and similar to what Norm mentioned concerning the Secretary of State. There were voters who faced similar threats when they went to cast their ballots. Individuals who wore Black Lives Matter shirts were turned away from voting in Tennessee and Georgia. We also received complaints about an old state flag bearing a Confederate emblem that was flying outside a polling site in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. One of our poll monitor volunteers in Attuga County, Alabama, was threatened with arrest as she was trying to monitor polls in a nonpartisan poll watching effort. Ballot boxes were set on fire in California and Boston. We know about robocalls that went to voters in Michigan, threatening them if they voted against the president. And there were also voter intimidation calls and voter intimidation mail in Detroit and New York, Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. So that's just a slice of some of the challenges that we faced. We had to sue in order to get access for African American voters in Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi in light of the pandemic and the onerous witness and signature requirements that were still placed upon them despite this health crisis. And then finally, I'll just say that we are still in litigation in two areas. Hopefully I can get into more detail about those suits, but one is involving the USPS, the United States Postal Service. who we all know slowed down delivery of mail, including ballots, leading up to the election. So from our vantage point, this election did not go smoothly. It went as well as it possibly could if you take into consideration the vast and enormous resources that civil rights organizations, organizers, activists, and voters themselves put into ensuring that our democracy prevailed.
Thanks, Janai. I'm wondering if you could, as a follow-up, describe a little bit about what you think is most important going forward to, again, acknowledging that, and I understand the perspective of, that there's lots of room for improvement, but that some things worked. What do you think that we need to do to fortify going forward to avoid the negative aspects of this last election?
Well, there are two important bills that are before Congress right now that could do an enormous amount of work to alleviate some of these pressures on voters and our election system. One is HR 1, which is the For the People Act, which would bring automatic voter registration to voters across the country. It would also allow for same-day registration, and it would provide early voting opportunities for 2 weeks leading up to the election for everyone at a minimum in the country, a minimum of 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends and evenings. That alone could take a number of the stresses off of our election system and open the franchise to voters and provide a more inclusive electorate. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note that, many of the deficiencies and discrimination in our election system were exacerbated by the rollback of critical protections in the Voting Rights Act as a result of the 2013 decision, Shelby County versus Holder. And there's a bill, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, that could be passed that would not only restore some of the protections of Section 5 that were struck down, but actually make preclearance, which is a method of vetting laws related to voting before they go into practice to make sure that they don't put minority voters in particular in a worse position. We could pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act and ensure that many of the obstacles that were erected in this election would not be passed. And in fact, election officials would be deterred from trying to pursue them.
Thanks. Let me ask, I intend this as kind of a follow-up for much of this conversation, but to all of you, given the nearly constant concerns, rhetoric, variety, I don't mean to be pejorative in describing it here, but on widespread voter fraud in the course of this election, we now face a situation where fewer Americans have faith in the accuracy of the election and the confidence in the results. How do we counteract the damage this does to our democracy? And Janai, maybe some of the legislation you were talking about, but are there other things that we should be doing, since it seems like for a variety of reasons, and maybe in some parts of the political spectrum more than others, but generally there are concerns that there wouldn't have been previously about in terms of confidence in the election.
This is a huge problem, and there are some things that we can do legally and structurally. A number of them mentioned in Ben's op-ed, and certainly what Janai said about a series of things, both to make voting easier, but also to provide protection against the kind of voter discrimination that has been in the history in this country, and those protections stripped in a decision in Shelby County that was predicated by Chief Justice Roberts on saying that, well, we don't see this discrimination anymore because, of course, the preclearance created the barriers against that discrimination. And the day after Shelby County was decided, in Shelby County, they were putting back those discriminations. But that's only one part of it. And unless we can move away from a group of pernicious actors who basically say, if we lose, it was fraudulent, who are now able to use social media and amplify conspiracy theories and repeat blatant falsehoods. And I mentioned Newt Gingrich before, things that have been completely debunked, and he knows better. This is not a dumb guy. Repeating them is going to basically be like its own virus in the political system, creating this level of distrust. All we can do, I think, is both to push back against that, to hope that we can continue to get courageous officials like the Georgia Secretary of State and others who do push back, but also to make these kinds of changes. And just to add a couple as well, I'd like to see Election Day move now to Veterans Day and times die to protect the right to vote. And if we can do that, along with having substantial early voting, that would help. And since we're likely to see now, even in the aftermath of the pandemic, a significant increase in voting by mail and early voting next time, people who haven't done it before now see that it's an easy thing to do. I prefer to have people vote in person. I think there's the civic beauty of turning out at the polls. But if we're going to have it, let's make sure that it works well. And that means that we have drop boxes everywhere so we don't have to rely on the Postal Service, that we have in every state ample opportunities for voters who don't do it exactly right, maybe don't put the signature in the right place, to cure their ballots afterwards when they are legitimately voting. And that we have states do what so many do, which is you begin to process votes by mail when they come in instead of waiting until Election Day, which means that we don't get the results for days or weeks, and they may be different from what we see on Election Day, which raises, at least for some people, the suspicion that something's gone wrong there. We had states that deliberately set the date at which you can begin to process them on Election Day so that they could get a skewed result. And what we've seen is that when states do this early, it makes it more legitimate for voters to see what the results are relatively soon after the election.
Let me come at this from a slightly different perspective, if I could. I think you have to acknowledge how polarized the country is, and the real split that took place in this election. While Joe Biden won and Donald Trump lost, Republicans did win down ballot races, maybe the most significant being in the state legislatures that actually do come up with most of these laws. And with redistricting coming up in the next couple of years, the Republicans are going to continue in all likelihood to control as many state legislative chambers as they do now. So it is important to I think, recognize how divided the country is and work from there. Now, to me, it was very alarming that the Trumpian rhetoric actually took root in such a large degree of the electorate. I don't believe there's any evidence of systemic fraud, but there are clearly a large percentage of the population that does. And if you actually want solutions to the problems of people voting without barriers being placed in their way, you got to take both sides into account. I would actually be in favor of setting up some sort of a process. Maybe it's federal, maybe it's private, maybe it's through the state legislatures, to give the people who think that there was fraudulent voting the ability to go out and try and prove their case. Certainly, look, there's been no evidence of systemic fraud that Republicans could find for the previous 4 decades. Donald Trump has not presented any in court at all. And you've still got this great churn going on. So to restore faith in the system and to take away this argument that our basic principle of elections doesn't work, you need to be able to, I think, give the forces who believe that there is fraud a platform to do what they can to investigate it and sort of either put up or shut up phase of the process. So I think we should probably work towards something like that. it's also important to recognize, I think, sort of a different way of looking at the election laws that the Republican governors and secretaries of state were able to rely on to say, we are going to certify these elections because they were valid. I mean, there is fraud, but there is also sort of an appearance suite of legislative proposals to be sure that the appearance that the election is fair goes into place. I think voter ID laws are part of that, for example. I think when Doug Ducey described in his 9-tweet series why he was going to reject President Trump's request and certify the elections, he referred to the way they do a hand review of signatures on absentee ballots. Arizona is a state without ballot harvesting. The Supreme Court's going to hear a ballot harvesting case in January, so that will probably have some impact on where we go from there. The principle of bipartisan poll watchers in all polling places, it's really important to be able to validate the results of an election and to say that there was no fraud that went on, or if there were incidents, to be able to run them to ground really quickly. It probably is a good idea, as a friend of mine has suggested, to do something of a trade-off about increasing the period of time in which voters can vote by mail or in person pre-election, but to have the results close on election day, that's the last day for receipt of ballots, because the uncertainty in a number of states of the final count was really the devil's workshop in this. And there is just a trade-off between extending election day past election day and still giving people ample opportunity to vote. So I think that there are a number of things that can be done to sort of get us back to a more even, less polarized view of the whole voting process and fraud and suppression dichotomy.
And can I just jump in to ask for clarification on one point? And you may have said this earlier and I missed it, but would you combine the ending a vote count on election day with also changing local laws so that votes that came in, for example, by mail ahead of election day could be counted, as was the case in some states, but not in others?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the processing of ballots, of absentee ballots, well in advance of election day helps get the results done. So the Pennsylvania and Michigan kind of slowing down of the processing of ballots, I think should be changed also. I do think those are going to have to be done state by state. I think this is not a federal legislation issue in order to get it done.
You know,
Can I jump in here?
Oh,
Janai and then Norm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly that, you know, to witness the alarmingly desperate attempts to cast doubt on this election and to elevate the non-issue of voter fraud is creating such dangerous conditions in our democracy. It's leaving a significant swath of the population virtually ungovernable. And that's what we're seeing on full display. When you think about the unity and cooperation and solidarity that will be needed to get us through this urgent health crisis of a pandemic, to grapple with the inevitable changing demographics of our country, you know, to ward off foreign interference, I can't think of anything, you know, more unpatriotic than sowing the seeds of doubt that you know, the president is doing right now. And, you know, not to be too Pollyanna-ish, but I think so much of this can be countered with responsible media coverage and through civics education. Sadly, the American electorate doesn't understand how elections are run. They don't understand all the different processes and steps that it takes to cast and count a ballot. And so it makes, it's just, you know, fodder and ripe, fertile ground to sow seeds of doubt and to make people believe in theories of fraud that just don't exist. And I am not in favor of increasing barriers to the ballot including draconian voter ID laws, or ending the counting of ballots on election day, when we know that there are other various ways in which voters are thwarted from actually getting their ballots to the election official on election day, including slowdowns in the post office, including lack of access to transportation and other means of casting a ballot. I don't think that we should base our election laws on false theories of voter fraud, which ultimately makes it more difficult for people to vote. What we want to do is make voting easier. We want to make voting accessible. And we want to, of course, make sure that it's safe and secure. And we can do all things without responding and caving to a false narrative of voter fraud.
So let me just add a couple of comments on what Janai said, but also on what Ben had said. On the insidious element of this and the destruction of the election system, which I would take even further. And I'll go back to where we started with the Electoral Count Act, because the Electoral Count Act also says that when Congress assembles on January 6th in a joint session to ratify those electors, slates of electors, if any one member of the House, joined by any one member of the Senate, challenges a slate of electors, the houses go back and convene and vote on the slate. And that can come in one of two ways: either a challenge to the single slate that's put forward by the state that's been certified, or if there is a competing slate that comes up. We already know that one representative, Mo Brooks of Alabama, has said that he is going to contest a number of these slates based on his belief that it was a fraudulent election. And there may well be a senator. And if they vote, my guess is that 20 or 25 senators, Republican senators, are going to vote against some of these slates that have been certified, and a much larger number of Republicans in the House. And that's going to make the challenge for a President Joe Biden to being able to govern much more difficult, because those members, if they do anything working with him, it's like they're working with an illegitimate president. So this is a challenge to governance as well as to the fundamentals of the system. On Ben's comment about having votes received only by election day, where we know the post office, even if it's working really well, all of us get letters that were sent 2 weeks before because there are glitches in the postal service. And the only way that I could accept the idea of only votes cast that were received by election day is if in every place there were huge numbers of drop boxes and an easy availability of people to put their ballots somewhere that doesn't have to be done by the Postal Service, that we know will be picked up by election officials before election day, and that the postage be free, and that we have a whole lot of other ways of making sure that those ballots come in. But if you have a voter who does everything the right way, casts a ballot a week in advance before the election and puts it in the mailbox, and it's received the day after the election because of Postal Service mistakes or delays, I don't see how you can basically justify not counting that person's vote. We need a whole series of things that would have to work to make that process one that would be workable for all.
Well, the states are a laboratory, and a number of states did require the cutoff on election day, and nobody's challenging those results on the basis of that. I think the main point is that you have to acknowledge how polarized the country is and how big a problem it is that there is this movement to cast doubt on the accuracy of the elections. And instead of kind of giving one party's dream of how to fix that, you need to come up with some compromises and some realization of the passions on both sides. And scolding one party at the expense of the other is not going to do that.
There's a couple topic areas I want to make sure we get in before we go to audience questions here. So I'm hoping that all of you would jump in on these. One broadly goes to what's appropriately federally, and what is goes to the decentralized election system we have that's spread over 9,000 plus jurisdictions nationwide. Your views on the extent to which this decentralized system with state and local officials helped in the protections of this election, and where and we talked about a little bit, where changes could be made in that or not. And then I also want to talk about the courts and what is ongoing there. But could I get reactions first on the state and local role and activity?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in very quickly. I think that in some ways we were saved by the fact that there wasn't universal federal control over every aspect of the election that could be manipulated by a reckless leader. And so there is some protection in ensuring that states have independence and oversight over their election processes. We know that there are local dynamics, local conditions that need to be addressed by those who are closest to them. And so there's a real benefit to having state and local officials inform the laws and rules governing elections, and they understand best the needs of their communities. And some of this really boils down to just basic understanding of geography and barriers and access and transportation. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some basic principles that can be handled at the federal level. And we've seen through the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act that occur with great success in protecting voters who are most vulnerable throughout the country. And the Voting Rights Act is an excellent example of how even at the federal level, you can address state and local conditions. You can tailor laws to address historical conditions, socioeconomic conditions, race discrimination, language barriers at the state and local level through federal legislation. So a combination of both, I think, continues to serve this population well, but there are a number of gaps, many of which have been identified by myself and my co-panelists here today, in terms of ensuring that Election Day is a holiday, making sure that we have automatic voter registration, making sure that there's ample time for early voting, et cetera, and restoring the right to vote to persons who have had their voting rights stripped because of criminal convictions, which is something that the For the People Act would do at the federal level. There are many fixes that we need federal legislation for. And again, the two bills that are pending before Congress now are an excellent step in that direction and can solve many of the ills that we see plaguing our election process.
Well, I think somewhere
I
between.
would add, go ahead, Ben.
No, go ahead, Norm. It's fine.
I would just add that there are appropriate roles for the states and appropriate roles for the federal government. It seems to me that the federal government, on the one hand, can provide resources that states and localities often don't do. That's what we saw with the one significant federal election law that provided a lot of money in the aftermath of the 2000 election, the Help America Vote Act, for voting machines and to improve the administration of elections. The second is to set broad guidelines to protect freedoms for voters and protect against discrimination for federal elections. And, just one small point, Ben mentioned this in his piece. We have a number of Supreme Court justices who are buying into the theory that because the Constitution gives the authority for the selection of electors to the state legislatures, and there's some question about how you define legislature under this, that the state courts have no role to play here. If we buy into that theory, then because the Constitution gives the authority to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections to Congress, the Supreme Court should have no role to play in regulating those elections. So we could ignore Shelby County under that kind of construct. I hope that is not where we go, because in a polarized system, especially with gerrymandered legislatures, we can see distortions in the system that take away voting rights in states. And if you don't have courts that are able to put some guidelines around that and interpret the state laws and put it into the context of freedoms, then we're also headed down a bad path.
I think between Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, giving the time, place, and manner to states to be able to decide those things about their elections, and the fact that there are 9,000 or 10,000 or 10,500 separate jurisdictions who have responsibility for a part of the casting and counting of ballots, there's a lot of room. And so I think one of the reforms that I'd really advocate is the consolidation within states of the number of jurisdictions that have responsibilities. I mean, this was not in this election, and it was not even in 2000, but there is an equal protection issue lurking in the fact that there are so many jurisdictions and they bring to bear different methods of counting ballots, and they'll take even the same instructions from the state and interpret them differently. And so consolidation of who's got responsibility for elections within states is one of those reforms that I think would be really helpful. And if you need an example of that, if states are the laboratories for reform, take a look at Georgia, which did make more uniform its voting system so that all the counties in the state essentially used the same voting machines. They were able to get two statewide recounts done within a 3 or 4 week period, which, if you've ever done a recount, is quite a tribute to them to have accomplished. So I think that there are, without getting into the more polarized reforms, there are a reform like that that could actually have some really positive effects on many of these issues.
Thanks, Ben. I know we have lots of audience questions and I want to leave time for them, but I also want to make sure we hit on the courts issue. So let me put this question out there and again, ask all of you for maybe lightning round responses on that. Concerns have been raised about the federal bench becoming increasingly politicized over the last several years. And that said, during this election cycle, we've had judges appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents repeatedly ruling against attempts to block or at least slow down the certification of election results. Do you think that this kind of widespread rejection of the legal gambits that have been put forward will encourage public trust, both in these election results and going forward? How do you think it impacts the perception of the court's role in securing the rule of law?
Well, I've been greatly encouraged by the fact that courts have so resoundingly rejected the frivolous lawsuits from this administration challenging the election and proving that the courts are still a venue and a forum for impartial, arbitration. I mean, that said, these lawsuits were so frivolous and so baseless that it was relatively easy for the courts to come to these conclusions and these outcomes. I hesitate to put too much faith in how this may continue to play out, particularly as we get into what my co-panelists have identified as the very highly politicized, highly polarized arena of redistricting and apportionment. And the court just last week heard argument about whether this administration can order different sets of census numbers to be used in the apportionment of congressional representation, and census numbers that in particular exclude persons who do not have authorized status to be in the United States, which would be, which has no historic precedent in this country. It would be a significant departure. I think it's when you have those thornier questions, when the answer isn't as obvious, that we will see how much we can rely on courts and how much faith the American electorate can have in courts. We do know that 1 in 4 appellate judges has been appointed by President Trump. We saw what Mitch McConnell has done to block judicial nominations in the prior administration, what it has done to ram them through in this administration. And so I think we are right to be wary about how our courts will serve us. But I was certainly pleased to see the courts do the right thing in connection with these lawsuits, and hope that we can rely on them to continue to do that as we face new challenges.
Thanks, Janai. Ben, before you speak, can I actually just work in one audience question that's on exactly on this point and is actually that someone wanted you specifically to answer. So previous question, and then layered on that, will the litigation we've seen turn into whack-a-mole if anyone can search for fraud? There are many, and I'm just reading the questioner verbatim, there are many of the election lawsuit cases where amateurs presented flawed statistical analysis as evidence. I'm concerned that accusations of little substance will spring up left and right.
Well, I mean, the courts do hear sort of anything that people bring to them, right? I mean, it's not that there's an initial screen by a panel of wise persons on what should really go to court and what shouldn't. So that I think in all different walks of litigation, there are sometimes frivolous suits filed, and courts really do know how to do with them. I think the court certainly played an essential and positive role in the election cases in this year. But I think more broadly, it's a really tough question to answer, because we tend to think that the courts are really doing a solid, substantive, terrific job when we agree with the decisions, and think the courts are falling apart when we disagree with the decisions. So I mean, I tend to look at it as the courts are an institution that are going to be there. These cases that came up post-election showed that Trump-appointed judges actually do have judicial independence. The Supreme Court showed it had some judicial independence when it rejected the Trumpian argument that the Manhattan DA did have the right to his financial papers. I mean, we've seen lots of examples of judicial independence. The courts will always be there as an important institution. You got to make your best arguments to them, and they get the final word.
Thanks. Let me.
It's important to note here that. Yeah, it's important to note here that we are very fortunate that this was a 306 electoral vote victory by Joe Biden. It could easily have been 270 votes, right at that margin. It could have been 290 votes where Pennsylvania would have brought it to 270, and then one faithless elector could have thrown the election into the House of Representatives. If it had been much closer, the pressure on state legislatures to intervene, and maybe even on judges to look at this in a different way, would have been greater and different. We are fortunate that state legislatures didn't take that bait, but it could have been a much greater challenge to the fundamentals of this system. So we dodged a bullet here.
Yeah, Norm raises a great point. And the real stress is not so much the Electoral College, but really narrow margin, Florida 2000 type margins in individual states that are outcome determinative. That's one of those things you can never predict is going to happen, but every once in a while it is going to happen. And that's when you need the system surrounding it to be able to handle it.
Yeah. Thanks. Let me raise a question here from Bloomberg News, a reporter from Bloomberg News. He asks, it appears not all litigation will be resolved in Wisconsin and other contested battleground states by tomorrow's safe harbor deadline. Will that make those states' appointment of Biden electors any less conclusive?
Well, the conclusive document is the certificate of ascertainment and the certification of results that are signed by different state officials. But that's the determinative factor for purposes of the safe harbor.
So that may in itself address the next question, which was, is the safe harbor presumption of correctness conclusive or rebuttable?
It's conclusive unless Congress decides it's not, and it should be conclusive. But I'll go back to what I said earlier, that we have one representative who's already said that he will challenge many of these results. If both houses of Congress rejected a slate of electors, we move into a completely different territory. It's not going to happen. This is not the first time that we've had questions raised. 2004, Democrats raised the question about the Ohio slate of electors. It's happened in Congress. It's not going to make a difference this time, but that's something to keep in mind, that it can be changed by Congress.
Let me take another question. Ben, this one was directed at you, but Janai, Norm, also feel free, please. Do you think that no matter what safeguards are put in place, there will still be those like Newt Gingrich, I think Norm mentioned him earlier, who will exploit doubts and polarize GOP voters will still distrust the system? So that's the question. Let me just ask. I would use that as a what can we do going forward? Is there anything that we can do to address these kinds of concerns?
Well, I mean, I think the good news about Newt Gingrich now is that he's making a political argument, and he has no authority over any state's voting processes. So, in some, doesn't really matter. Look, I think that what the Trumpian strategy that did fall flat this time showed is that there can be stress testers on this system anytime, and you need to guard for those provisions. Again, in the terms of the big picture, people believing that there was fraud, I'm for giving them a forum to prove it and to put up and shut up strategy. If they had a legitimate case of fraud, then this also would have been a very different situation. So the other lesson is, if you honestly believe that an election is somehow corrupted and not run properly, you got to have this basic thing called evidence. And rhetorical statements alone will not change the results of an election, but evidence could.
So I just, I mentioned Newt, but let me also mention that when you have the majority leader of the Senate, the Republican leader of the House refuse to acknowledge that we have a president-elect, when you have a cabinet officer like Alex Azar go on television on Sunday, and when he says Vice President Biden, and Chris Wallace corrects him by saying President-elect Biden, and he refuses to acknowledge it, and when you have a director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, pursuing conspiracy theories on television on Sunday, it makes it much harder to convince that broader portion of the electorate that believes this election was fraudulent something otherwise. We need to have some real gut checks and changes in behavior by opinion leaders who are officials, elected officials and otherwise, or we're going to careen out of control here in a bad way.
I couldn't agree more. This is a moment for leadership. This is a moment to put, country over party. This is a moment for true patriotism, which requires us to be as loyal as possible to the Constitution, loyal to the rule of law, to not allow this divisiveness to degrade what is such a promising multiracial, multicultural democracy. And it's extraordinarily disappointing, if not alarming, that we see continued reinforcement of this myth of an election steal. And it is already teetering on the brink of actual violence against election officials, which then undermines the willingness of people to be public servants and to be those who we can laud and compliment when an election is successful. You are going to see people shy away from that work if this is what it entails. So it requires leadership on the part of all parties, and I will say in this particular moment, the Republican Party, to stand up and put an end to what is absolutely corroding our process. It's one thing to be competitive. It's one thing to certainly have your own ideological views and disputes and ideals, but it is an entirely different thing when that actually threatens the continued safety of our country.
Let me just say, we have sadly come upon the end of our time, and I know that I feel like I could continue discussing this with all of you, and I think our audience could as well. But we are at the conclusion here. In wrapping up, I just want to point people, because we touched on disinformation, but I think that there was much more we could have discussed there. And I'm going to ask folks who are interested in more on that topic to look at americanprogress.org/events. We had a particular discussion on what we can do to combat misinformation, particularly on social media. So those of you who want more on this, please feel free to go there. And I want to take this moment to thank each of you, Ben Ginsberg, Janai Nelson, Norm Ornstein. You're all true patriots and are doing incredible work to safeguard our election systems and our democracy. And we thank you for it, in addition to thanking you for your time here today. Very much appreciate having you.
Thank you, Mara.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Wow.